It's 1952, deep in the red earth of the Australian outback. A 5-year-old Aboriginal girl wakes to the sound of an engine truck outside her home, men's voices, her mother's hands suddenly grabbing her, trying to hide her behind their makeshift shelter. But it's too late. They've been seen. She doesn't know it yet, but this will be the last morning she'll ever see her mother. Men with clipboards step out, calling themselves protectors. They're looking for children like her, specifically with lighter skin, children they believe can be more easily absorbed into white society. They called it protection, but it was theft of childhood, of culture, of identity. The officials tell her mother that this is for the child's own good, better education, better opportunities, a better life away from these conditions. They tell her she should be grateful they're saving her daughter. Grateful. They actually use that word. Thousands of Aboriginal children were taken, taught to forget who they were, and punished if they remembered. Her mother screams. It's a sound that will echo in that little girl's nightmares for the next 70 years. A mother's scream when her child is being stolen. Her mother fights, clawing at the officials, begging in her language, then in broken English. Please, please, she's mine. She's my baby. The officials pry her mother's fingers away, one by one. The little girl feels her mother's wedding band scrape against her arm as they're torn apart. That sensation, cold metal against skin, will haunt her forever. The little girl is thrown into the back of a truck with other crying children. Her face is pressed against the back window, her small hand splayed against the hot glass. She's screaming for her mama over and over until her voice breaks. She watches her mother collapse to her knees in the red dirt, hands reaching toward the disappearing truck. She watches her mother become smaller, and smaller, and smaller, until she's just a speck, then a memory, then a ghost that will haunt every single day of her life. That image, her mother on her knees in the dirt, will be the last clear memory she has of the woman who gave birth to her. Because she's only 5 years old, and memories fade, especially when people spend the next decade trying to erase them from your mind. She doesn't know that she'll never see her mother again. She doesn't know that decades from now, she'll be unable to remember her mother's face clearly, only that feeling of being ripped away. She doesn't know that she's one of an estimated 100,000 children who will suffer this exact trauma across Australia alone. But here's what will shatter you. This wasn't unique to Australia. This wasn't an isolated tragedy. This wasn't one government making one terrible mistake. This was systematic. This was global. This was genocide. From the frozen tundras of Canada, where temperatures dropped to -40, where they still took children in the dead of winter, to the scorching deserts of Arizona, where Native American children walked hundreds of miles trying to get back home. From the mountains of Norway, where Sami children were torn from reindeer-herding families, to the green hills of New Zealand, where Maori children forgot their own language within months. Across every inhabited continent, Indigenous children were stolen. Their hair was cut. Their names were erased. Their languages were beaten out of them. Their cultures were called savage. Their gods were called devils. Their mothers were called unfit. And they were sent to places that called themselves schools, but functioned like prisons. Places that claimed to offer salvation, but delivered systematic abuse. Places that promised education, but taught shame. Places where children died in numbers so high that they had to dig mass graves in the backyard and pretend it never happened. This is the story of the stolen generations, and I need you to understand something before we go further. This isn't history that's comfortable to hear. This isn't a story with a happy ending. This isn't something you can watch and then forget about. Also, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and tell us where you are watching from. Because these people are still alive. The woman we just talked about, she's 77 years old now. She still cries when she talks about that morning. She still has nightmares about her mother's face disappearing into the dust. She still wonders if her mother ever stopped looking for her. She still carries the guilt, the irrational, impossible guilt, that maybe if she'd held on tighter, maybe if she'd fought harder, maybe she could have stayed. Her children struggle with attachment because she never learned how to parent. Her grandchildren have anxiety disorders they can't explain. The trauma literally changed her DNA in ways that scientists are still studying. 3 generations later, her family is still dealing with what happened that morning in 1952. This is not ancient history. This is your parents' generation, your grandparents' generation. This happened in the lifetime of people who were still walking this earth, still carrying this pain, still searching for answers that will never come. By the end of this video, you'll understand why entire communities are still broken, why languages that survived for 60,000 years died in a single generation, why families are still searching for relatives on DNA websites, why the trauma echoes like a scream that never quite fades, and you'll understand why we can never, ever let this happen again. To understand these stories, you need to know this. Between the early 1900s and the 1970s, governments in Australia, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Scandinavia systematically removed Indigenous children from their families. The goal was assimilation, or more accurately, cultural erasure. In Australia, the Aborigines Protection Act gave officials the power to take any Aboriginal child without consent or court order. In Canada, over 150,000 children were forced into residential schools with the explicit motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." In the United States, similar boarding schools operated under the same philosophy. The pattern was global, the intent was genocidal, and the damage was irreparable. Now, let me tell you what that actually meant for real people. Lorna's story. Yaz. Lorna was 3 years old when they stole her soul. That's how she describes it now, at 86. They didn't just take her from her family, they took something inside her that she's never been able to get back. It was 1942, the middle of World War II. While the world was focused on battles overseas, another war was being waged in the Australian outback. A war against children, a war against culture, a war against love itself. Lorna was playing near her family's camp in Western Australia. She remembers the feeling of red dirt between her toes. She remembers the sound of her grandmother singing. She remembers feeling safe. That's all she remembers of happiness. Just the feeling of it, like trying to remember a dream after you wake. Her mother had gone to gather bush tucker, food for the family. Just for an hour. Just an hour away from her baby. That hour would stretch into eternity. The government patrol arrived like a death squad. Though they carried clipboards instead of guns, they had informants, other Aboriginal people who'd been coerced, threatened, or broken into helping them. Someone had told them about Lorna. Someone had described the little girl with lighter skin, the one who could pass. Her grandmother, her beloved grandmother, whose voice was Lorna's lullaby, tried to hide her. She clutched Lorna to her chest so hard that Lorna couldn't breathe. She begged them in language, then in English. She offered herself instead. "Take me," she said. "She's just a baby. She needs her mother. Take me." They laughed, actually laughed, as if a grandmother's love was a joke, as if a child's terror was amusing. They pulled Lorna away. Her grandmother's fingernails scratched Lorna's arm as they were separated, not meaning to hurt her, just unable to let go. Lorna still has a faint scar. She touches it sometimes, the only physical connection to that moment, to that love. Lorna remembers her grandmother's screams. She says it was a sound that wasn't quite human. It was primal, ancient, the sound of a soul being torn in half. Other women from the community tried to intervene, but there were police there too, ready to make arrests, ready to use violence if needed. Inside the truck, Lorna wasn't alone. There were 5 other children, all stolen that day. The oldest was maybe 7. They cried together until they couldn't cry anymore, until their throats were raw and their eyes were swollen shut, and they had no more tears left. A 7-year-old tried to comfort the younger ones, even though she was shaking with terror herself. That's what they did to children. They forced them to grow up in an instant. They stole their childhood in a single day. Lorna was taken to Moore River Native Settlement, about 80 miles north of Perth. It sounds like a school. It sounds benign. It was hell. The dormitory held 42 girls in a space meant for 20. They slept on thin mattresses that smelled of mold and other children's fear. The windows had bars, not to keep people out, to keep children in. 3-year-olds behind bars. Lorna's first lesson was washing clothes in freezing water at dawn. She was 3 years old. Her hands were too small to properly wring out the sheets. The matron hit her hands with a wooden spoon for not doing it right. Lorna's hands bled. The matron said this would teach her about proper work ethic. She was 3 years old. They inspected her mouth, her teeth, looking for signs of disease or poor breeding. They examined her skin in different lights to document her exact shade. They measured her skull with calipers. Actual scientific racism, actual eugenics, trying to determine how much Aboriginal blood she had and whether she could be successfully bred white. They did this to a 3-year-old child who just wanted her mother. They cut her hair. Aboriginal culture sees hair as sacred, as connected to identity and spirit. They didn't care. They cut it short, hacked it really, with dull scissors that pulled and hurt. Lorna touched her head afterward and sobbed. She didn't understand why they'd done it. She thought she was being punished, though she didn't know for what. The first time she spoke in her language, just the word for mama, that's all, just crying for her mama, they slapped her across the mouth so hard she tasted blood. A matron bent down and hissed in her face. "Your mother doesn't want you. That's why you're here. Speak English or don't speak at all." Lorna stopped speaking entirely for 6 months. At 3 years old, she stopped speaking. The staff noted this in her file as progress in becoming civilized. By the time she was 5, Lorna could scrub floors, wash clothes, polish shoes, serve food, and stay absolutely silent for hours. These were the skills they were teaching her, how to be a good servant. That was the future they envisioned for her. Not education, not opportunity, servitude. When she was 7, she wet the bed. She was having nightmares about her mother and grandmother, and she couldn't make it to the bathroom in time. They made her stand in front of the other girls wearing the wet sheet over her head for an entire day. They called her the little savage who couldn't even control herself like a proper child. The other girls were too afraid to comfort her. That's what the system did. It made children afraid to show each other kindness because kindness might be punished next. When Lorna was 15, she was hired out. That's what they called it, though hired implies choice, implies payment. She was sent to work as a domestic servant for a wealthy white family in Perth. She lived in a tiny room behind the kitchen, barely bigger than a closet. She worked from 5 a.m. until 11 p.m., 7 days a week. She was supposed to be paid. Her wages went into a trust account managed by the government. She never saw a penny of it. When she finally got access to those records decades later, they showed payments for months she never worked, deductions for expenses that never existed. The government had stolen her childhood and then stolen her wages too. At 23, Lorna was released from service. That's the word they used. Released like she was a prisoner, which is exactly what she was. She was now free to make her own way in the world, except she had no family, no education beyond basic reading, no money despite working since she was 15, no identification papers, no birth certificate, no proof she even existed beyond the government files that documented her theft. She was lost in Perth, a city she didn't understand. She couldn't read social cues because she'd been institutionalized for 20 years. She didn't know how to make friends because she'd been taught that attachment was dangerous. She didn't know how to advocate for herself because she'd been beaten down for 2 decades. She found herself in abusive relationships because she didn't know what healthy love looked like. She had children young because she desperately wanted family, wanted to fill the hole inside her, but she didn't know how to mother them. How could she? She'd never been mothered herself. Not really. Her own mother was stolen from her at 3. When Lorna was in her 40s, someone told her she could search for her family. The idea had never occurred to her. She'd been told so many times that they didn't want her, that they'd given her up, that she'd internalized it as truth. She started writing letters to government departments, to Aboriginal welfare organizations, to missions, to anyone who might have records. Most didn't respond. Some said their records had been lost or destroyed. Some told her they couldn't help without more information. But how could she provide information when she'd been 3 years old when she was taken? It took her 8 years. 8 years of searching, of dead ends, of hope raised and crushed. Finally, she found a distant cousin who'd maintained family records. That's how she learned her mother's name, her mother's actual name, not the one she half remembered from being 3 years old, but her full name, her identity. Her mother had died in 1989, 17 years earlier. Lorna had been so close. If she'd started searching sooner. If the government had helped instead of hindered. If the records hadn't been hidden. If. Her mother died never knowing what happened to her daughter. She died not knowing if Lorna was alive or dead, happy or suffering, remembering her or having forgotten. She died with that wound open, bleeding, never healed. And Lorna had to live with knowing she'd been alive all those years. She'd been just a few hours away. They could have reunited if the system hadn't worked so hard to keep them apart. Lorna finally found a photograph of her mother. One single photograph. She stares at it for hours sometimes, trying to match this face to her faded 3-year-old memories, trying to remember if those eyes are the ones she saw that last morning, trying to hear her mother's voice in her head, but it's gone, erased, stolen like everything else. At 86, Lorna has reconnected with her community. She's learned what she could of her language, though it's hard when you're learning as an adult what you should have learned at your mother's knee. She participates in cultural ceremonies, but she always feels like an outsider, a guest in what should have been her birthright. When Lorna speaks to school groups now, when she tells her story to young people who can barely comprehend what happened, she always says the same thing at the end. They didn't just take me from my mother, they took my mother from me. They took her face from my memory. They took her voice from my ears. They took 60,000 years of culture from my heart. And no amount of apologies, no amount of money, no amount of time can give that back. I am 86 years old, and I am still that 3-year-old girl reaching for her mother. I will die still reaching for her. There is no happy ending to Lorna's story. There can't be. You can't undo that kind of loss. You can't repair that kind of damage. You can only witness it, acknowledge it, and make damn sure it never happens again. Theodore's story. Theodore was 6 years old when they murdered him. Not his body, that kept breathing for another 67 years. But they murdered who he was supposed to become. They murdered the Cree boy who loved his language, who was learning to hunt with his father, who knew the stories of his people. In 1958, Theodore lived with his family in northern Manitoba. Their home was a traditional cabin, heated by a wood stove that his father tended. In the mornings, his mother would braid his long black hair while singing to him in Cree. His grandfather was teaching him to read animal tracks in the snow. His grandmother was teaching him the plant medicines of their people. He was loved. He was safe. He was Cree. Then the agents came. It was March, still deep winter. Temperatures were 30 below zero. That didn't matter. The schedule said it was time to collect children, so they came. Theodore's father tried to stop them. He stood in the doorway, his body between them and his son. They moved him aside like he was nothing. When he tried again, they arrested him. Right there, in front of Theodore, handcuffed his father and threatened him with jail if he interfered with government business. Theodore's mother held him so tight he couldn't breathe. She was crying, saying something in Cree over and over. Theodore would spend the rest of his life trying to remember what she said. He thinks it was, "Don't forget who you are," or maybe "I love you," or maybe "I'll find you." He doesn't know. The memory is gone, stolen like everything else. They dragged him out into the freezing cold. He wasn't dressed for travel. He was in his home clothes, meant for inside a heated cabin, not for a 5-hour drive in March. He shook so violently in the back of the car that his teeth cut the inside of his mouth. He tasted blood and terror and goodbye. The residential school was 300 miles from his home. 300 miles might as well have been 3,000. He'd never been further than the next village. Now he was in a building bigger than anything he'd ever seen, full of strange children speaking strange languages, run by white people in black robes who looked at him like he was dirt on their shoes. They stripped him naked as soon as he arrived. All the new children, boys and girls together, naked and shivering, while staff hosed them down with cold water. They said it was delousing, but Theodore didn't have lice. None of the children did. It was humiliation. It was breaking them down. It was teaching them that their bodies weren't their own anymore. They cut his hair. In Cree culture, as in many indigenous cultures, hair holds spiritual significance. Hair connects you to your people, to the earth, to the Creator. Theodore had never had his hair cut. His mother braided it every morning. It was past his waist, black and beautiful, and his. They hacked it off with dull scissors that pulled and tore. They didn't care that he was crying. They laughed about how he looked like a proper boy now, instead of a little squaw. They swept his hair into a pile with all the other children's hair and threw it in the trash. Theodore tried to save some. He tried to grab a piece of his hair from the trash. They caught him and beat him for scavenging like an animal. He was taken to a dormitory with 43 other boys. Bunk beds in tight rows, no privacy, no personal belongings allowed, no photographs, no toys, no reminders of home. He was assigned a number, 47. The staff called him that instead of his name. The first time he spoke Cree was the next morning. He didn't even know he was doing it. He was tired and scared, and he forgot where he was. He asked another boy, "Where's the bathroom?" in Cree. A staff member appeared out of nowhere and slapped him across the face so hard he fell off his bed. His ear rang for 3 days. The staff member dragged him by his arm, he could feel it bruising, to a small closet. She threw him in and locked the door. It was perfectly dark, not a crack of light. Theodore had never been in total darkness before. In his family's cabin, there was always the glow of the fire, the stars through the window, moonlight on snow. This was absolute blackness. He was 6 years old. He was terrified. He screamed and pounded on the door until his hands were bruised and his voice was gone. No one came. He eventually wet himself because he'd asked where the bathroom was and never got an answer. He sat in his own urine in the dark for 6 hours. When they finally let him out, they beat him again for soiling himself. Then they made him clean the closet with his bare hands while other children watched. Another lesson: showing weakness gets you punished. Asking for help gets you punished. Being Cree gets you punished. Theodore stopped speaking entirely after that. Not just Cree, he stopped speaking at all. For almost a year, he was selectively mute, communicating only through nods and head shakes when absolutely necessary. The staff noted in his file that he was sullen and difficult, but that the silence was better than hearing that savage language. They were breaking him, and it was working. The residential school was run by Catholic priests and nuns. Theodore was forced to attend Mass twice a day. He didn't understand Latin. He didn't understand the prayers, but he had to kneel until his knees ached, had to stay perfectly still, had to pretend to worship a God that allowed this to happen to children. One of the priests would choose boys to help him in his private office. Theodore watched boys go in crying and come out dead-eyed. He prayed to the God they were forcing on him that he wouldn't be chosen. His prayers weren't answered. What happened in that office, Theodore wouldn't talk about for 50 years. Even when he finally told the Truth Commission, he couldn't say certain things out loud. He would just shake his head and cry. The transcript reads, "Witness overcome with emotion, unable to continue." What we know is this: sexual abuse was rampant in residential schools, documented, widespread, protected by the institutions. Children had no one to tell who would believe them, no one to protect them. They were at the complete mercy of their abusers. Theodore learned to disappear, mentally, emotionally. He would go somewhere else when he had to. He'd imagine he was back home, out on the trap lines with his father, the crisp winter air in his lungs, the sound of snow crunching under snowshoes. He'd go there in his mind and leave his body behind to endure whatever was being done to it. It's called dissociation. It's a survival mechanism. It saved his life. It also fractured his sense of self in ways he would never fully repair. Theodore watched children die. Actually die. A 9-year-old boy named Jimmy developed tuberculosis. TB was epidemic in residential schools because of overcrowding, poor ventilation, and inadequate medical care. Jimmy coughed blood for 3 weeks before anyone took him to a hospital. He died 2 days later. They buried him in an unmarked grave behind the school. His parents weren't notified for 6 months. When they finally found out, they weren't given his body. They weren't told exactly where he was buried. Their son just disappeared. Theodore got sick too, pneumonia when he was 9. He had a fever so high he hallucinated. He thought he saw his mother standing at the end of his bed. He reached for her and fell out of bed. The staff found him on the floor, unconscious. They dragged him back to bed, but didn't call a doctor. Medicine was expensive, and those children get sick all the time anyway. He survived. Not all children did. Theodore estimates he saw at least 10 children die during his time at the school. The staff always had explanations: weak constitutions, tuberculosis, accidents, never neglect, never abuse, never murder through indifference. When Theodore was 8, he tried to run away. He'd heard other boys talk about it. Some had tried and failed. One had succeeded, or so they said. Theodore decided to try during winter, which was stupid because it was 40 below zero, and he was 300 miles from home with no supplies, no proper clothing, no survival gear. He didn't care. Death was preferable to staying. He made it 23 miles. He walked through the night, following the road, hoping he was going the right direction. His feet went numb within the first hour. His face went numb after that. He probably would have died of hypothermia within another few hours. Police found him at dawn, collapsed in a snowbank. They dragged him back. The beating was administered publicly, in front of the entire school. They bent him over a bench and beat him with a leather strap 25 times. He was 8 years old. The pain was indescribable. The strap cut through his thin pants, raised welts on his skin, made it impossible to sit for weeks. But worse than the pain was the humiliation. All the other children were forced to watch, to see what happened when you tried to go home, to learn that escape was impossible, that hope was dangerous, that this was their life now and they should accept it. Theodore never tried to run again. They'd broken that in him. They'd broken hope. By the time he was 12, Theodore had been completely institutionalized. He worked in the school's fields, growing food that they fed to staff while students ate spoiled meat and moldy bread. He did his work silently, mechanically. He didn't make friends because friends could be taken away, could die, could hurt you. He didn't cry because crying was weakness. He didn't hope because hope was pain. He was a ghost, a body going through motions. The Cree boy who loved his language, who knew animal tracks, who was supposed to grow up to be a hunter and a father and a keeper of stories. That boy was dead. Theodore was just the shell walking around, waiting to be released. When he was 16, they sent him home. Just put him on a bus and told him his time at the school was finished. No preparation, no transition support, no therapy for the decade of trauma. Just, you're done. Go back to your reserve. The community Theodore returned to barely recognized him. His hair was still short. He spoke English with an accent that marked him as institutional. He'd forgotten most of his Cree. When his grandmother spoke to him, he had to ask her to speak English. She cried. His grandmother actually cried, looking at him, seeing what they'd done to her grandson. She tried to hug him, but he flinched. He'd learned that physical touch meant pain. Even love felt dangerous. His parents had changed too. His mother had descended into alcoholism, trying to drown the pain of losing her children. Theodore's 3 younger siblings had also been taken to residential schools. His father was quiet now, broken in a different way, the fight beaten out of him by a system that made him powerless to protect his own children. Theodore tried to reintegrate. He tried to relearn his language, his culture, his identity. But the damage was too deep. He felt like he belonged nowhere. Too white for the reserve, too Indian for white society. Not Cree enough, not Canadian enough, just broken. He started drinking at 17. It helped numb the memories, the nightmares, the flashbacks. It helped him sleep without seeing the faces of children who died. It helped him not feel the ghost hands of the priest on his body. It helped him survive by not surviving, just existing in a haze. By 20, he had a criminal record. By 25, he'd been in and out of jail multiple times. By 30, he was homeless, living on the streets of Winnipeg, a statistic in a system that was designed to produce exactly this outcome. Theodore had 3 children with 2 different women. He couldn't be a father to them. How could he? He'd never had a childhood. He'd never been parented after age 6. He had no model for healthy relationships, healthy attachment, healthy love. His children grew up afraid of him, not because he was violent, but because he was absent even when he was present. Trauma had stolen his ability to connect. In his 40s, someone took Theodore to a traditional healing circle. It was the first time since he was 6 years old that he sat in a circle with other Indigenous people, speaking Cree, practicing ceremony. He cried so hard he vomited. all that trapped pain, all that suppressed grief, all that stolen identity. It came pouring out of him in a healing that was also a breaking open. It took decades, but Theodore eventually found some healing. He relearned his language, though it never felt fully natural again, like wearing clothes that don't quite fit. He participated in ceremonies. He spoke publicly about residential schools, adding his voice to thousands of survivors who refused to let this history be buried. He testified at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2012 at 68 years old. He brought a photograph of himself at 6, taken just before he was sent to the school. In the photo, he's smiling, wearing traditional clothing, his long hair braided. He held up the photo and said, "This is who they killed. This boy right here. He had a future. He had a culture. He had a language. He had a family who loved him. And they took him, and they destroyed him. And they did it on purpose. They did it because they wanted us gone. They wanted our culture gone. They wanted our languages gone. They wanted us to disappear. Well, I'm still here. I survived. But I shouldn't have had to survive. I should have been allowed to just live." Theodore died in 2019 at 73 years old. His obituary listed the cause as heart failure. But everyone who knew him knew the truth. Residential school killed him. It just took 61 years to finish the job. He died having found some measure of peace, some reconnection to his culture. He died having seen the official apology. He died knowing that the truth was finally being told. But he also died with nightmares. He died estranged from 2 of his 3 children. He died without ever fully recovering the language his mother sang to him. He died with a 6-year-old boy still trapped inside him, still screaming in that dark closet, still waiting for someone to let him out. And he died knowing that there are unmarked graves at that school, that children he knew, children he watched die, are buried in the ground without headstones, without ceremony, without even the dignity of their names recorded. He died knowing that it happened, that it was real, that it wasn't exaggerated or misremembered, that the horror was exactly as bad as he remembered, and he died knowing that there are still people who don't believe it, who think survivors are lying or exaggerating, who want to forget this history instead of facing it. But Theodore didn't forget. He couldn't. The trauma was literally written into his body, his brain, his DNA, and he refused to let the world forget either. Sarah's story. Sarah was taken in 1971, not 1871, not 1921, 1971. The same year Disney World opened, the same year Apollo 14 landed on the moon. This wasn't ancient history. This was recent enough that your parents might remember it. Sarah was 7 years old, living with her family on the Navajo Nation in Arizona. Her childhood was rich in ways the boarding school would later tell her was poverty. She spoke only Diné Bizad, Navajo language, and it was beautiful, complex, one of the most difficult languages in the world. She knew the stories of her people, stories that had been told for thousands of years. She knew which plants were medicine and which were food. She knew how to weave. She knew the prayers. She knew who she was. The boarding school wasn't as far away as Theodore's in Canada. It was only 100 miles. But distance isn't measured in miles when you're 7 and being taken from everything you know. It might as well have been the moon. Her parents were told that education was mandatory, that if they didn't comply, they'd lose their government benefits, their land allotments, potentially their other children. They were told the boarding school would give Sarah opportunities they couldn't provide. They were told it was the law. What choice did they have? Say no and lose everything? Say yes and lose their daughter? They chose survival. They let her go. And Sarah would spend the rest of her life hating them for it, then hating herself for hating them, trapped in a cycle of misplaced blame because she couldn't direct her rage at the system that did this to all of them. Sarah's first day at boarding school, they told her she was dirty. She wasn't. Her mother had bathed her that morning, braided her long hair with care and love. But they said she was dirty because being Indian meant being dirty in their eyes. They cut her hair. Sarah's grandmother had never cut her hair in her life. It was past her knees, a source of pride. Spiritually significant. They hacked it off to her shoulders, uneven and ugly. Sarah touched her head afterward and felt like part of her soul was missing. In Navajo culture, hair is your connection to your thoughts, to your identity. They'd literally cut away part of who she was. The first time she spoke Navajo, she was hit with a ruler across her knuckles. The teacher didn't explain why, didn't tell her the rules first and then punish her for breaking them. Just hit her. Sarah was 7 years old and had no idea what she'd done wrong. She'd just asked another Navajo child where the bathroom was in the only language she knew. The message was clear. Your language is wrong. Your culture is wrong. You are wrong. Sarah cried silently at her desk. She'd learned in one day not to cry out loud. That made it worse. So she cried silent tears that rolled down her face and dripped onto her uniform, and no one comforted her, because comfort wasn't part of the curriculum. She learned English fast, not because she was gifted at languages, though she was, but because speaking Navajo meant pain, and 7-year-olds will do anything to avoid pain. Within 6 months, Sarah could speak English fluently. Within a year, she was forgetting Navajo words that should have been celebrated as success by her teachers. Instead, they looked at her with suspicion. She'd learned too well. She'd become too good at being what they wanted her to be. Now she was threatening. An Indian who could speak like them, think like them, compete with them. They could never win. If she didn't assimilate, she was a savage who needed to be civilized. If she did assimilate, she was a threat who needed to be kept in her place. Sarah excelled academically. She got straight A's. She memorized everything, read everything she could get her hands on. Education became her escape. When she was lost in a book, she wasn't in that place. When she was focused on homework, she wasn't thinking about home. But her teachers never praised her. Her report cards always had comments like, bright but difficult, or intelligent but doesn't know her place, or good grades but poor attitude. Because how dare she be smart? How dare she excel? How dare she be Indian and intelligent at the same time? At night, Sarah would try to remember her grandmother's face. She'd try to remember the prayers. She'd try to remember the feeling of home. But memories fade, especially when you're 7. Especially when there's nothing to reinforce them. Especially when every day you're told that what you're remembering is wrong and shameful. She started having nightmares. In her dreams, she'd be back home, but everyone would be speaking English. Or she'd be trying to speak Navajo, but English would come out. Or she'd see her grandmother, but couldn't remember her name. The nightmares felt like premonitions. They were showing her what was being stolen in real time. By the time Sarah was 13, she existed in a horrifying limbo. She wasn't Navajo anymore. She'd lost too much of the language, too much of the culture, but she wasn't white. She still looked Indian, still faced racism, still was treated as less than. She belonged nowhere, to no one, not even to herself. Sarah graduated high school with honors. The boarding school actually used her in their propaganda. Look, we take savage Indian children and turn them into successful students. She was in their brochures, their presentations to potential donors. They used her success to justify the whole system. She wanted to burn those brochures. She wanted to scream that she succeeded despite them, not because of them. That every A she got was an act of resistance. That she survived, but survival isn't success. That they didn't save her. They destroyed her, and she pieced herself back together from the rubble. But she smiled for the photos, because she'd learned that too. How to perform. How to be the good Indian. How to make white people comfortable. She was accepted to college, a university 3 states away. She thought distance might help. She thought maybe in a big city. Away from the reservation, away from the boarding school, she could figure out who she was. Instead, she found that the further she got from home, the more lost she became. In college, Sarah was the only Native American student in most of her classes. White students would ask her to speak Indian for them, like it was a party trick. They'd ask if she lived in a teepee, if she knew rain dances, if she could track animals. They'd wear Indian princess costumes for Halloween and get offended when she told them it was racist. She was exotic to them, a curiosity, not a person, not someone with depth and trauma and complexity, just their token Indian friend. The isolation was crushing. She'd call home, but the conversations were stilted. She'd lost too much Navajo to talk to her grandparents easily. Her parents didn't understand her life at college. Her younger siblings who'd grown up on the reservation and hadn't been sent to boarding school were fully Navajo in a way she'd never be again. She didn't belong at college. She didn't belong at home. She didn't belong anywhere. Sarah dropped out after 2 years. The school counselor called it a waste of potential. Sarah called it survival. She couldn't take one more day of being the only brown face in the room, of explaining her existence, of defending her right to be there, of feeling like an imposter in both worlds. She went back to the Navajo Nation, but home didn't feel like home anymore. The landscape was the same, but she was different. She'd missed crucial years of cultural transmission. While she was away, her cousins had learned ceremonies she'd never learn. They'd strengthened their language while hers atrophied. They'd maintained connections she'd lost. At family gatherings, everyone would naturally speak Navajo. Sarah would understand maybe 60%. She'd respond in English because her Navajo wasn't good enough, and people would look at her with pity or disappointment. Her own grandmother would sometimes forget and talk to her in full Navajo, then have to stop and translate when Sarah's face showed she didn't understand. The pain in her grandmother's eyes when that happened was unbearable. The disappointment, the loss, the knowledge that they'd taken her granddaughter and returned someone else. Sarah's 20s and 30s were defined by survival. She worked whatever jobs she could get: waitress, clerk, cleaner. She was overqualified for all of them with her high school honors. But she had no degree, no connections, no confidence that she belonged in professional spaces. She had relationships that all failed because she didn't know how to be vulnerable. She'd push people away the moment they got too close because closeness meant pain. The boarding school had taught her that. She struggled with identity in ways that non-Indigenous people couldn't understand. She was too white for some Native people because she'd lost her language. She was too Indian for white people because of her face, her name, her history. She was suspended between worlds, belonging fully to neither. And the worst part? She blamed herself. She internalized the shame. She thought, if I'd tried harder to remember, if I'd been stronger, if I'd been better, maybe I wouldn't have lost so much. It took her decades to understand that this was the point. This was what the system was designed to do: create people who were fractured, lost, ashamed. Create people who would struggle their whole lives, then blame themselves for struggling. In her 40s, Sarah made a decision. She would reclaim what was stolen. She started taking language classes with elders. She participated in ceremonies. She learned traditional weaving, something her grandmother had tried to teach her before she was taken. It was harder than anything she'd ever done, harder than surviving the boarding school, harder than dropping out of college, because she was learning what she should have known instinctually. She was learning her own culture as a tourist, an outsider trying to get in. The elders were patient with her. They understood. She wasn't the only one. There were dozens of people her age in the same position, stolen children who grew up and tried to come home, only to find that home was a language they had half forgotten, stories they'd half remembered, ceremonies they'd never learned. They were wounded birds trying to remember how to fly. Sarah became a teacher, not at a boarding school, at a community school on the Navajo Nation. She taught language preservation. She taught children their own culture so they wouldn't lose it the way she had. Her students' parents would thank her, not knowing that every lesson she taught was her trying to give these children what was stolen from her. Every word of Navajo she taught was her fighting back against the system that tried to erase it. Every story she shared was an act of resistance. Now, in her 60s, Sarah has grandchildren. They speak Navajo fluently, better than she does. She's given them what she couldn't give her own children. She's broken the cycle in her family, but the cost... Sarah still has gaps in her language, still feels like an outsider at some ceremonies, still has moments where she doesn't fully understand something cultural and has to ask, and the asking reminds her of what was taken. She still has nightmares. In her nightmares, she's 7 years old and they're cutting her hair. Or she's trying to speak to her grandmother, but only English comes out. Or she's back at that boarding school and she can't leave. She's stuck there forever, and no one is coming to save her. She keeps a photograph from before the boarding school. She's 7, her hair is long, she's wearing traditional clothing, she's smiling with pure joy. She looks at it sometimes and mourns that little girl, mourns what she could have been if they'd just left her alone. Sarah says, "They didn't kill my body, but they killed something inside me. They killed the girl I was supposed to become. They killed my fluent Navajo. They killed my unself-conscious connection to my culture. They killed my sense of belonging, and then they had the audacity to call it education, to call it help, to call it progress. I've spent my entire adult life trying to reclaim what was stolen from me, and I'll never fully get it back. I'm 62 years old, and I'm still that 7-year-old girl, still confused about why they cut my hair, still crying for my grandmother, still trying to find my way home. This is what cultural genocide looks like. It's not just history, it's me, it's my life. It's the hole in my heart that can never be filled. And it happened in 1971, not a century ago. It's so recent that the building is still standing. The people who did this to me are still alive, and people wonder why we can't just get over it. Sarah's story isn't unique. There are thousands like her. A generation caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither, spending their lives trying to piece together identities that were systematically shattered. And the trauma doesn't end with them. Their children feel it. Their grandchildren feel it, 3-4 generations down the line. And the effects of cultural genocide still ripple through families like aftershocks from an earthquake that never quite stops. This is the human cost. This is what assimilation policy actually means when you translate it from bureaucratic language into human suffering. These 3 stories represent millions of individual tragedies. The health impacts are staggering. Survivors have higher rates of PTSD, depression, substance abuse, and chronic health conditions. But it doesn't end with survivors. Their children and grandchildren carry the trauma too, in what's called intergenerational trauma. The trauma literally gets passed down through generations, changing DNA expression. Indigenous communities still suffer the effects today. Higher poverty rates, lower life expectancy, massive overrepresentation in prisons and child welfare systems. In Australia, Indigenous children are still being removed at rates 10 times higher than non-Indigenous children. They call it the new stolen generation. But here's what matters. Indigenous peoples have survived. Against impossible odds, cultures are being revitalized. Languages are being reclaimed. Young people are proud of their heritage. Governments have apologized. In 2008, both Australia and Canada issued official apologies to survivors. Truth commissions documented the horrors. In 2021, hundreds of unmarked graves were discovered at former residential schools in Canada, confirming what survivors had been saying for decades. But apologies without action are hollow. Survivors are still fighting for full compensation, for implementation of recommendations, for justice, and they're joined by younger generations demanding change. We're coming to the end of this story, except it's not really the end, is it? Because this story is still being written in the bodies and minds and hearts of survivors and their descendants. Let me tell you what we've really been talking about for the last hour. We've been talking about a crime so enormous that we struggle to comprehend it. We've been talking about governments and churches and societies that looked at children, babies, toddlers, elementary school kids, and decided that their identities needed to be destroyed. Not reformed, not improved, destroyed. We've been talking about mothers who had their children ripped from their arms and spent the rest of their lives wondering if they were alive or dead, happy or suffering, remembering them or having forgotten. We've been talking about children who lost their names, their languages, their families, their cultures, their childhoods, their dignity, and sometimes their lives. We've been talking about genocide, not the Hollywood version with gas chambers and firing squads, the quieter version, the one with clipboards and laws and schools and churches, the one that kills cultures instead of bodies, though it killed plenty of bodies too. Between 1910 and the 1970s, not ancient history, not centuries ago, but within living memory, hundreds of thousands of Indigenous children across Australia, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Scandinavia were systematically stolen from their families and subjected to cultural annihilation. The goal was explicit: destroy Indigenous identity, kill the Indian, save the man, breed out the Aboriginal blood, civilize the savages, assimilate them into white society whether they wanted it or not. For decades, they tried to hide what happened. Records were destroyed, survivors were silenced, official histories were sanitized. They wanted this crime to disappear along with the cultures they tried to erase. But survivors refused to be silent. They testified. They organized. They demanded truth. Apologies came eventually. The world finally admitted what happened. But admission isn't enough, because it's still happening in different forms. Indigenous children are still being removed at disproportionate rates. Indigenous peoples are still incarcerated at exponentially higher rates. Indigenous communities still face the highest poverty rates, lowest life expectancy, highest suicide rates. But here's what they didn't count on. Here's what they never understood. Indigenous peoples are still here, despite everything, despite the theft, the abuse, the attempted annihilation. Indigenous cultures have survived. Languages that were nearly lost are being revitalized. Traditions that were forbidden are being reclaimed. Young people are proud of their heritage instead of ashamed. This is resistance. This is resilience. This is the refusal to let genocidal policies achieve their goal. But let me be absolutely clear about something. Survival is not a happy ending. Resilience is not redemption. The fact that Indigenous peoples survived doesn't make what happened to them okay. It doesn't excuse it. It doesn't lessen it. Lorna will die never having remembered her mother's face clearly, never having had a childhood, never having fully belonged anywhere. Theodore died with nightmares, died estranged from his children, died knowing that other children are buried in unmarked graves and the world didn't care enough to give them proper burials. Sarah will spend the rest of her life suspended between worlds, fluent in a language that's not fully her own, struggling in a language that should have been her birthright. And they're the survivors. They're the ones who lived. Think about the ones who didn't. Think about the children who died in those institutions and were buried without ceremony, without their parents being notified, without their names even being recorded properly. Think about the mothers who died, never knowing what happened to their children. Think about the cultures that were lost completely because every speaker of a language died before they could pass it on. Now, I want you to think about something uncomfortable. If you're watching this video from Australia, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, or any colonized nation, you benefit from this history. The land you live on, the resources you use, the society you participate in. All of it was built on the colonization that included these policies. That doesn't make you personally responsible for what happened. You didn't steal those children. You didn't run those schools. You didn't make those policies. But you are responsible for what happens now. For whether this history is remembered or forgotten, for whether justice is pursued or ignored, for whether Indigenous peoples get sovereignty and reparations or continued marginalization. So, what can you do? First, don't look away. Don't minimize it. Don't say, well, people were doing their best with the knowledge they had. They knew. There were people at the time saying this was wrong. There were Indigenous people screaming that this was wrong. They knew, and they did it anyway. Second, educate yourself beyond this video. Read books by Indigenous authors. Watch documentaries made by Indigenous filmmakers. Listen to survivors' testimonies. Center Indigenous voices in learning about Indigenous history. Third, support Indigenous-led organizations financially if you can. Support language revitalization programs, healing centers, advocacy organizations. Fourth, push for political change. Contact your representatives. Demand full implementation of truth and reconciliation's recommendations. Demand reform of child welfare systems. Demand land back. Demand sovereignty. Demand justice. Fifth, take action in your daily life. Learn whose land you're on. Support Indigenous artists and businesses. Call out racism when you see it. Show respect. The goal is a future where Indigenous children are never removed from their families because of their race, where Indigenous peoples have true self-determination, where cultures that have survived for tens of thousands of years aren't just preserved like museum pieces, but are living, thriving, growing. Remember that little girl from the beginning of this video? The one taken in 1952? Her name is actually Lorna. She's real. Her story is real. She's 77 years old now, and she agreed to let me tell her story because she wants the world to know. She wants you to know that she still has nightmares about that morning, She still wakes up sometimes, reaching for her mother. She still touches the scar on her arm, where her grandmother's fingernails scratched her, the only physical proof that she was loved before she was taken. She wants you to know that she's not a victim waiting to be saved. She's a survivor who rebuilt herself from rubble. She's an elder now, teaching young people, passing on what she managed to reclaim of her culture. She's broken the cycle for her grandchildren. But she also wants you to know that survival isn't the same as being okay, that healing isn't the same as being healed, that she carries that 5-year-old inside her every day, still confused about why they took her, still crying for her mama, still believing somehow that if she'd just held on tighter, she could have stayed. And she wants you to know that she's one of thousands, thousands of stories just like hers. Thousands of children who became adults carrying child-sized wounds, thousands of families torn apart, thousands of cultures damaged, thousands of languages lost or nearly lost. And she's one of the lucky ones, because she survived, so many didn't. We still don't know how many children died in residential schools and institutions. Canada has confirmed over 4,000 deaths, but the real number is likely much higher. In Australia, deaths were often not recorded, or records were destroyed. In the United States, investigations are just beginning. Those children deserve to be named, to be remembered, to be mourned. Their families deserve to know what happened to them. They deserve proper burials, proper ceremony, proper respect. There are still mothers who died waiting for their children to come home. There are still children, now elderly, who are still searching for siblings they last saw 70 years ago. There are still families fractured across generations, the connections severed so violently they can never be fully repaired. This is the legacy of the stolen generations. This is what cultural genocide looks like when you zoom into the human level. This is the price of colonization that we rarely talk about, honestly. But here's what I want you to leave with. Indigenous peoples are not just victims of history. They are makers of the future. They are scientists and artists and teachers and leaders and healers. They are language keepers and land protectors and culture bearers. They are your neighbors and classmates and colleagues. They have survived. And they will continue to survive. Not because it's romantic or inspiring, but because they refuse to let genocidal policies succeed. Because they hold on to their identities with a fierceness that comes from having those identities nearly stolen. They are here. They are demanding justice. They are healing while still wounded. They are reclaiming while still grieving. They are building futures while still processing past traumas. And they are asking you to be their allies, not their saviors, not their speakers, their allies. There's a word in many indigenous languages that roughly translates to all my relations. It's a recognition that we're all connected, that what happens to one group affects all of us, that we're responsible to and for each other. The stolen generations are all our relations. Their pain is part of our collective history. Their survival is part of our collective future. Their call for justice is a call we must all answer. This is not ancient history. This is not a sad story from long ago that we can learn from and move past. This is living history. This is present-day trauma. This is ongoing colonization. And this is our responsibility, all of us, for the children who were taken, for the mothers who never stopped searching, for the survivors who carry wounds we can never fully understand, for the ones who didn't survive, for the languages that were lost, for the cultures that were damaged, for the childhoods that were stolen, for the families that were fractured. We remember, we witness, we will never let this happen again.